The first time I stitched a killer, I told myself it would be the last. Out here on the western frontier, promises had a way of dying faster than men. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne, and for 12 years I served the isolated valley of Black Hollow. The nearest town with another physician lay nearly 60 miles away across rough mountain trails. If someone was shot, bitten by a snake, or crushed beneath a wagon, they came to my cabin, or they died before sunrise. People believed doctors were neutral. The frontier didn't. Every decision carried a price. One bitter autumn evening, rain hammered against the roof while icy wind forced smoke back down my chimney. I had just extinguished the last lantern when 3 hard knocks echoed across my front door. Not polite knocks. Desperate ones. When I opened it, 4 riders stood beneath soaked hats. Their horses trembled with exhaustion, and every one of the strangers carried a revolver. Between them hung another man, barely conscious. Blood streamed through his fingers. "Doctor," the tallest rider growled. "Help him." I didn't need introductions. Every newspaper sketch in 3 territories had taught me those faces. The Ash Creek Gang. Robbers. Train thieves. Wanted for more murders than anyone cared to count. The wounded man collapsed onto my floor before I answered. Medical instinct overruled fear. I knelt beside him. Bullet wound. Lower abdomen. Heavy blood loss. If I wasted another minute asking questions, he'd bleed to death. Put him on the table. Nobody moved. The leader narrowed his cold gray eyes. "You ain't afraid?" I reached for clean cloth. "I'm afraid all the time. But fear has never stopped bleeding." For the first time, one of the outlaws almost smiled. The operation lasted nearly 3 hours. No electricity. No assistance. Only boiling water, crude surgical tools, whiskey, morphine, and candlelight. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed the intestines by inches. A miracle. When I finally tied the last stitch, sweat soaked my shirt despite the freezing night. The patient still breathed. Barely. One outlaw placed a leather pouch on my desk. Gold coins. Far more money than I'd earned in 6 months. "I don't take blood money," I said. The room became silent. Hands drifted toward revolvers. Then the leader stepped forward. "What do you take?" I looked around my tiny clinic. Broken windows. Nearly empty medicine shelves. Bandages running low. Children in nearby farms often died because I lacked supplies. Finally I answered. "Medicine." Confusion crossed their faces. "Morphine. Alcohol. Quinine. Surgical thread. If you insist on paying, bring those." The leader stared longer than comfort allowed. Then he nodded once. "You've got yourself a deal." I should have refused. Instead, I shook his hand. That single handshake would haunt the rest of my life. 3 weeks later they returned. Another wounded outlaw. Then another. Then another. Always after midnight. Always through the back door. Never speaking names. I never asked. The valley assumed my growing stock of medical supplies came from wealthy ranchers. No one questioned why my shelves were suddenly full. Children survived fevers that once killed them. Farmers recovered from infected wounds. Mothers stopped dying during childbirth. The medicine arrived exactly as promised. No gold. No questions. Only supplies. But every shipment carried invisible chains. Each time I healed another outlaw. The secret grew heavier. Winter buried Black Hollow beneath snow. One freezing morning Sheriff Amos Callahan rode into town. Unlike most lawmen, Amos wasn't cruel. He had delivered my own wife to safety years earlier during a flood. He trusted me. Perhaps too much. He entered my clinic carrying folded newspapers. "Morning, Elias." I poured him coffee. "You look tired." "I've been chasing ghosts." He spread wanted posters across my desk. Every face belonged to the Ash Creek gang. They've disappeared. No robberies. No witnesses. No bodies. He studied me carefully. "It's almost like somebody's keeping them alive." My hands stopped moving for only a heartbeat. "Too long." Amos noticed. Doctors learn to hide emotions. Sheriffs learn to notice them. "You all right?" "Long night." He accepted the answer. Or pretended to. Before leaving, he placed one final poster on my desk. The gang's leader. Silas Reed. Reward. $5,000. Enough money to rebuild every farm in the valley. Enough to buy a real hospital. Enough to change hundreds of lives. As the sheriff rode away, I stared at the poster for several minutes. Then quietly folded it. Not into my pocket. Into the fireplace. The paper curled into black ash. Some secrets couldn't be sold. Not anymore. The next knock came 2 nights later. But this time. It wasn't an injured outlaw standing outside. It was Silas Reed himself. He wasn't bleeding. He wasn't smiling. And for the first time since our strange agreement began. He looked afraid. "I need your help," he said quietly. "It isn't one of my men." He hesitated. "It's my little girl." At that moment, I realized something I had forgotten long ago. Even the most feared outlaw in the West could still be a father. And whatever waited beyond that door would test every oath I had ever sworn. I had treated killers, thieves, and desperate men whose names I never wanted to know. But a sick child was different. There were no wanted posters for children. No rewards. No crimes. Only fear. Silas Reed led me through the frozen wilderness beneath a moon hidden by thick clouds. Neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath our horses and the distant howl of wolves echoing through the valley. After nearly 2 hours, we reached an abandoned silver mine. From the outside it looked deserted, but hidden lanterns glowed between the rocks. The Ash Creek gang had built an entire camp beneath the mountain. Men who terrified 3 territories lowered their rifles when they saw me. Not because they trusted me. Because Silas did. He hurried me into a small wooden cabin tucked deep inside the mine. On a narrow bed lay a little girl no older than 8. Her cheeks burned with fever. Her breathing came in painful, shallow gasps. Her name, Silas whispered, was Grace. She opened frightened blue eyes as I approached. "You the doctor?" she asked weakly. "I am. Papa says you fix people." "I try." She managed a tiny smile before another violent cough shook her small body. I examined her carefully. High fever. Severe cough. Pain in her chest. The moment I placed my stethoscope against her back, I knew the truth. Pneumonia. Without treatment, she might not survive the week. The cabin fell silent as I looked at Silas. "She needs constant care." He swallowed hard. "Can you save her?" "I don't make promises." "I'll do everything I can." For the first time since I'd met him, the notorious outlaw looked less like a gang leader and more like a frightened father. The next 5 days became the longest of my career. I remained inside the gang's hidden camp, treating Grace with every medicine I had brought, quinine for the fever, warm compresses, careful hydration, and endless hours watching over her fragile breathing. Every night I expected the sheriff to discover where I had vanished. Every morning I wondered whether Grace would still be alive. The gang watched me constantly. Not with threats. With hope. One outlaw chopped firewood for the cabin without being asked. Another boiled fresh water before I requested it. A third spent half a day riding through a snowstorm simply to find extra blankets. These were the same men accused of robbing banks and killing deputies. Yet here they stood, terrified of losing one little girl. The frontier had taught me something most civilized people never understood. Good men could do terrible things. Terrible men could still love deeply. Nothing was ever as simple as the newspapers claimed. On the 6th morning, Grace's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and asked for breakfast. The entire cabin seemed to breathe again. Silas stepped outside before anyone noticed the tears running down his face. I pretended not to see them. Some moments deserved privacy. When Grace was strong enough to sit beside the fire, she handed me a tiny wooden carving of a bird. I made it, she whispered. So you won't forget me. I turned the little carving over in my hand. It was rough and uneven. Perfect. I'll keep it forever. She smiled. Children always knew when adults meant what they said. Before I left the camp, Silas stopped me outside. Snow drifted lazily between the pine trees. He carried no revolver. Only a weathered leather notebook. I want to show you something. Inside were names. Dates. Amounts of money. Every robbery. Every stagecoach. Every train. Every family the gang had secretly helped. I frowned. I don't understand. Silas looked toward the mountains. You've heard we're monsters. I've heard many things. Some are true. His voice grew quieter. But not all. He explained that years earlier, corrupt railroad investors and powerful land companies had stolen ranches from dozens of valley families through forged deeds and bribed judges. The law had protected the wealthy. Not the innocent. The Ash Creek gang had formed to fight back. At first they robbed only the companies responsible. Then bounty hunters came. Deputies were killed. Friends died. Revenge replaced justice. The line between outlaw and murderer disappeared. We became the thing we hated, Silas admitted. I know that. But every winter. He pointed toward several wagons hidden beneath canvas. We leave food outside widows' homes. We pay debts anonymously. We buy medicine. We keep children alive. I looked at the notebook again. There were receipts from pharmacies. School donations. Church repairs. Orphan supplies. None of it erased murder. But it complicated the story. The West rarely offered heroes. Only people making impossible choices. When I finally returned to Black Hollow, Sheriff Amos Callahan was waiting on my porch. His horse stood tied to the fence. His expression told me everything. He knew I had been somewhere. I've been looking for you, he said. I had patience. For 6 days. I remained silent. He stepped closer. Elias. We found tracks. They ended near the northern ridge. He watched my face carefully. The Ash Creek gang is hiding somewhere in those mountains. His words hung in the cold air. Then came the question I had feared for months. Tell me where they are. I looked at the sheriff. A good man. An honest man. A man who truly believed justice still existed. Then I remembered Grace's smile. The medicine delivered to my clinic. The children in Black Hollow who were alive because of supplies paid for by outlaws. And the families who would starve if another war erupted across the valley. I can't help you. Amos stared as though he'd never seen me before. You know. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He removed his badge slowly and slipped it into his pocket. This isn't official anymore. This is one friend asking another. If you stay silent, people will die. I answered with the hardest words I'd ever spoken. So will people if I don't. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. Finally Amos climbed onto his horse. "When the shooting starts, I hope you've chosen the right side." He rode away without looking back. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, I realized something terrible. The fragile piece I had helped build was beginning to crack. And when it finally shattered, no amount of medicine would be enough to save everyone. Sheriff Amos Callahan's warning echoed through my mind for days. "When the shooting starts, I hope you've chosen the right side." I wished there were a right side. Instead, there were only people I cared about standing on opposite ends of a rifle barrel. The valley grew restless. Farmers whispered about deputies arriving from neighboring counties. Stagecoach drivers refused to travel after sunset. Ranchers locked their barns earlier than usual, and every stranger who rode into Black Hollow was watched with suspicious eyes. The peace that had lasted nearly a year was slipping away. Then, just before dawn one cold morning, the peace finally died. A horse galloped into town carrying a wounded deputy. He had been shot during an ambush in the northern pass. Before I could even finish bandaging him, another rider burst through my clinic door. It was one of Silas Reed's men. His clothes were soaked in blood. "The sheriff found us," he gasped. "They've surrounded the canyon." For one terrible moment, my clinic became the center of the war. On one bed lay a deputy. At my door stood an outlaw begging for help. Both were bleeding. Both would die without me. I closed my eyes for only a second. Then I pointed toward the empty examination room. "Bring your man inside." The deputy looked at me in disbelief. "You're helping them?" I met his eyes. "I'm helping the wounded. That's all I've ever done." By sunset, the valley echoed with rifle fire. The battle spread through the frozen hills like wildfire. Smoke drifted above the pine trees. Every few hours another injured man arrived. Deputy. Outlaw. Ranch hand. No matter who crossed my doorway, I treated them in the order they needed me, not by the badge they wore or the crimes they had committed. Some cursed me. Others thanked me. Most simply survived. Word spread quickly. Dr. Elias Thorne had chosen no side. He had chosen life. Late that evening, Sheriff Callahan himself staggered through my clinic door. A bullet had torn through his shoulder. Blood soaked his coat. Before I could speak, he smiled weakly. "I suppose I'm your patient now." I guided him onto the table. "Hold still." As I removed the bullet, neither of us spoke. Finally Amos broke the silence. "They're trapped. Silas and what's left of his gang. They won't make it until morning." I tied the final bandage. "It doesn't have to end that way." He looked at me carefully. "You still believe they'll surrender?" "I believe fathers think differently than outlaws." Ignoring every warning, I saddled my horse and rode toward the canyon alone. The gunfire had nearly stopped. The silence frightened me even more. When I reached the rocky pass, dozens of rifles immediately aimed in my direction. Deputies on one side. The Ash Creek gang on the other. One nervous trigger pull could start the massacre all over again. I dismounted slowly, raising both hands. "I'm unarmed." Sheriff Callahan stepped from behind a boulder. Across the canyon, Silas Reed emerged with only 6 exhausted men beside him. Nearly half his gang was dead. The survivors looked broken. Silas noticed the doctor's bag hanging from my shoulder. "You came." I said I would help. He gave a tired laugh. "You always do." Standing between both sides, I spoke louder than I ever had in my life. "I've spent 12 years sewing together what bullets tear apart. I am tired. So are all of you." No one interrupted. I looked first at the deputies. If this fight continues, more widows will bury their husbands. Then I turned toward the outlaws. And more children will grow up without fathers. Finally, I faced Silas. You once told me you became the thing you hated. Don't let that be the last chapter of your story. The canyon remained silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Silas slowly removed his revolver. Then another. Then the rifle from his shoulder. One by one, his remaining men followed. Metal struck frozen ground. No one moved. Sheriff Callahan stared in disbelief. You're surrendering? Silas nodded. On one condition. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. Name it. My daughter never pays for my sins. If she's innocent, she stays free. Amos looked toward me. I simply nodded. After a long pause, the sheriff extended his hand. You have my word. Silas reached across the frozen earth and shook it. The war ended with a handshake instead of another gunshot. Months later, the trials began. Silas Reed confessed to every robbery he had committed. He accepted responsibility for the lives lost because of his choices. Several surviving gang members received long prison sentences. Others, whose crimes were less severe, were given hard labor instead of the gallows after local families testified about the anonymous food, medicine, and money they had received over the years. The truth was finally known. The Ash Creek Gang had committed terrible crimes. But they had also saved lives. Justice, imperfect as it was, tried to recognize both. Silas was sentenced to life in prison. Before he was taken away, he asked to see me one last time. I owe you more than I can repay, he said. You don't owe me anything. He smiled faintly. I owe you hope. From his pocket, he handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a map. Hidden across the valley were several caches of stolen gold. Beneath the map he had written only one sentence. Return it to the people who lost everything. I looked up. Why trust me? Because you never asked who deserved saving. The following spring, Black Hollow began to change. The stolen money rebuilt burned ranches. A new school opened beside the church. The bridge that had collapsed years before was finally repaired. And on the edge of town, workers raised the walls of something I had dreamed about for years. A real hospital. Not a lonely cabin. Not a one-room clinic. A place where no one would be turned away. Above its entrance, the townspeople carved a simple inscription. Mercy is stronger than fear. I never asked who suggested those words. Perhaps everyone did. Every year, on the first day of winter, a young woman visited the hospital carrying fresh wildflowers. Grace Reed had grown into a kind, intelligent woman who became a schoolteacher in the valley. She always placed the flowers beneath the old oak tree outside my office. We rarely spoke about the past. We didn't need to. One snowy afternoon she handed me another small wooden bird, carved far more carefully than the first one. You kept the old one? She asked. I opened my desk drawer. There it was. Worn smooth by time. I told you I'd never forget. She smiled. My father said a doctor once saved his life. I shook my head gently. No. I only gave him the chance to save what was left of it. As the winter sun disappeared behind the mountains, I realized the frontier had taught me its greatest lesson. Law could punish. Revenge could destroy. But only mercy could end a cycle of violence. And sometimes, the strongest peace was built not by heroes or outlaws, but by one doctor who refused to stop seeing the humanity in both.